Ever feel like your mind and spirit are like on totally different pages?
Hmm.
Especially when it comes to some of the more intense personality disorders.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going deep today. We're talking Mental Health in the Church by Peter Janicki.
Yeah.
And trust me, this book does not mess around.
No, it really doesn't. And Denicki's background is fascinating. I mean, the guy's got expertise in both psychology and theology.
Talk about a unique perspective.
Right. It's not just about, checking off symptoms. It's about understanding the whole person, their struggles, their faith. It's complex.
Totally. So, should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
All right. Let's talk about a disorder we hear everywhere these days. Narcissistic personality disorder, NPD.
Right.
It's almost become like a buzzword,
Yeah, it has.
But Janicki helps us move past the label and really get into the nitty-gritty of how NPD actually shows up. And get this, even in church settings.
Oh, absolutely. And the clinical definition itself, according to the DSM-5, it's pretty eye-opening. Constant need for admiration, this inflated sense of self-importance, like off the charts. But here's the thing that always gets me. The lack of empathy.
Whoa.
It's like they can't or won't truly understand how others are feeling.
So how does that play out in a church? Are we talking about someone who's always got to be in the spotlight?
Ding, ding, ding. We've got a winner. Think about someone who always dominates conversations, needs to be the center of attention. You know the type. Every little thing they do, they crave praise for it, like over-the-top praise.
And forget about someone else's good news. It's got to be about them.
Exactly. They have a hard time genuinely celebrating others because it's always got to come back to them.
And this need for control, right? Because Janicki makes this, honestly, kind of scary connection between NPD and Jezebel in the Bible. He even pulls out verses from Kings and Revelations, to drive the point home.
He does. And it's his multi-path model for NPD that's really fascinating. Janicki's saying it's rarely just one thing that causes this. It's like genetics, psychology, their social situation, even spiritual influences all mixed up together.
He even says there might be a link between past trauma and even demonic influence in some situations.
Yeah, he goes there, especially when trauma's involved. Janicki doesn't shy away from those possibilities. It can get pretty intense.
And here's where my mind was blown. Janicki doesn't just stop at NPD in general. He's got these different types of narcissism, right?
He does.
He talks about grandiose versus covert narcissists. Can you, break that down for us? Those sound like two totally different people.
Right. So picture this. A grandiose narcissist. They're loud and proud about needing attention. Always want that external validation. They might be drawn to positions of power or authority where everyone sees them as the best, most spiritual, most gifted. You get the picture.
So it's look at all the amazing things I'm doing for God. That type.
Exactly. Now, covert narcissists, they're trickier. On the surface, they might seem shy or even self-deprecating.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, but underneath, that same need for admiration, that need to control, it's all still there, just simmering below the surface.
So how do you even spot a covert narcissist in a church? What are you looking for?
It's tough, right? Think about someone who's always playing the victim, using guilt trips or hiding behind their faith to control others. They might even use their supposed piety to avoid taking responsibility for their actions.
Wow, that's really subtle but powerful. It makes you wonder, how often are these patterns playing out right in front of us and we don't even realize it?
It really does. Things aren't always as they seem, that's for sure. Discernment is key here.
It really is. Okay, so moving from the complexities of NPD, Janicki dives into another one, borderline personality disorder, or BPD. What's crucial for us to understand about BPD, especially in the context of faith?
One of the most difficult aspects of BPD is the emotional roller coaster, those intense highs and lows, and the relationships, they can be so chaotic. Have you ever felt that, terrifying fear of someone leaving you, even if it's completely irrational?
Oh, yeah.
Janicki says that's a huge red flag for BPD.
And here's something I found interesting. Janicki suggests that societal pressures to maintain this perfect image, we always have to have it all together.
Oh, totally.
He says that might actually be contributing to the rise of BPD.
Makes sense, right? It's like this pressure cooker of trying to appear fine while internally you're struggling.
Yes, and especially in a church environment where there's this expectation, even if it's unspoken, to have unshakable faith, to have your life together.
Absolutely.
It's going to be so hard for someone with BPD to handle that.
It really is, especially when you factor in what Janicki calls cognitive distortions.
Ooh, what are those?
Basically, it's like these unhelpful thought patterns. He gives the example of someone with BPD thinking, God doesn't care about me. Can you imagine? It would be so hard to connect with your faith if you truly believed that deep down. Deneki stresses that it's not enough to just address the psychological stuff. We've got to address the spiritual needs of someone with BPD, too, because they're totally intertwined.
That's powerful. It's like being stuck in this like vicious cycle,
Yeah.
you know, feeling unsteady in your faith. And then on top of that, dealing with BPD, it just makes me think about how much stigma there is around mental health in some churches.
Yeah.
Deniki's really pushing for more compassion, you know?
Yeah.
Like, we've got to do better.
100%. And that leads us to another disorder Deneki tackles, and it's a tough one. Dissociative identity disorder, or DDD.
IDD. I'll be honest, when I hear DD, I think like movies, you know?
Yeah, it gets sensationalized.
But Deniki's point is this is real life. This is serious, serious trauma. It's not Hollywood.
No, not at all. And he's very clear about that in the book. Deneki is not about having a quirky personality. It comes from deep, often childhood trauma.
And one of the things Deneki talks about that I find, I don't know, fascinating and so sad at the same time, is how the different alters, those different personalities within DDD,
Right.
they often identify in such specific ways,
Yeah.
like as children or angels, demons. He even says sometimes as the opposite gender.
It's wild, isn't it? It just shows you how complex the human mind is, how we find ways to cope when things get too overwhelming.
So how does that even like happen in the brain? What's going on that someone develops ADD?
So Deneki explains that this fragmentation of the self, it's a way of surviving trauma, especially in childhood. Like, the trauma is so bad that the mind is like, we have to create separate selves to protect ourselves. Think about it as your brain having this alarm system, right?
Okay, yeah.
That's your limbic system.
Yeah.
And trauma's like hitting the panic button on that system. For some people, DD is like their brain's way of trying to shut off that alarm for good.
So the brain is literally trying to protect itself from pain.
Exactly. And get this, Deneki talks about the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's all about rational thought, logic.
Yeah.
He says that part can actually quiet down the limbic system, the emotional center. So in a way, Deneki is like the ultimate form of dissociation.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. But what about the spiritual side of Deneki?
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you have alters that present as like demonic.
Yeah.
That's got to be scary, right, for the person and the people around them.
Yeah, it's definitely an area where we need a lot of sensitivity, discernment, and honesty, humility. Deneki really cautions against jumping to conclusions about someone with DD, especially about what's happening spiritually.
So not every altar that seems demonic is actually demonic possession.
Exactly. Deneki believes that while Denade almost always comes from trauma, there might be times when you need spiritual intervention too, but you really need to be careful about figuring that out. It takes compassion, information, and really putting that person's well-being first.
It sounds like navigating mental health and faith together, it just takes a lot of wisdom, especially with something as complicated as DDD.
It does. It's about acknowledging both the psychological and the spiritual, and realizing that what we see on the surface, it's not always the full story. And Deneki comes back to that again and again in the book.
Okay, so we've covered NPD, BPD, DID. My brain is full. We're done now.
You wish. We've got one more to tackle. Deneki also digs into another big one, bipolar disorder.
Because it's so much more than just being moody, as people like to say.
Oh, yeah, way more. Bipolar disorder involves these huge swings in someone's mood and energy, and it can be really disruptive to their life. Imagine feeling like you're on top of the world one day, full of energy, and then the next you're completely down in a deep depression. Deneki's honest about how hard that is, those mood swings. It affects your relationships, your job, everything.
And in a church, I bet those ups and downs are especially hard. People probably don't get it, or even worse, they see it as like a spiritual failing.
All the time. And that's why it's so important to understand this stuff. So with bipolar disorder, we're talking about these really dramatic mood swings between two extremes. That's the bipolar part. You've got mania, which is like this surge of energy, racing thoughts, maybe even doing risky things.
Intense.
And then the opposite swing is depression. Down, down, down.
So it's not just feeling happy and then sad. These are big, life-altering shifts.
Big time. And to make it even more complicated, there are different types of bipolar disorder.
Oh, no more.
I know, right? But Deneki talks about bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. They're different in how intense the mania is and how long it lasts. Bipolar 1 has the most extreme manic episodes, while bipolar 2 has hypomania, which is less intense but still a really big deal.
Okay, so knowing the difference is key here. And Deneki mentioned something else that kind of worries me, which is that bipolar disorder often comes with other mental health stuff too. He says anxiety, substance abuse, even suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, and that's something everyone needs to understand. If you're going through this or someone you love is bipolar disorder doesn't usually just show up alone. It's usually tangled up with other issues, so you've got to address all of them. That's why treatment is so complex.
So what does treatment for bipolar disorder look like?
Well, medication's usually a big part of it to help manage those extreme moods. Lithium, for example.
Okay.
But Deneki is a huge fan of what he calls wraparound care. It's not just meds, it's also things like therapy to deal with the root issues, regulating your sleep schedule, your routines, and of course, spiritual support is crucial.
Makes sense. Like you're treating the whole person, not just trying to mask the symptoms. But how can churches be supportive to people with bipolar disorder without just saying it's a spiritual problem?
That is the million-dollar question, and it goes back to what we keep saying. Education is key. Churches can be amazing support systems, but only if they're willing to learn about mental illness and treat it like the real and complex thing that it is.
It's like we need to know when to offer support and when to say, hey, you might need a professional for this. Because a prayer is powerful, but it's not always the only answer, right?
Right, and it's about recognizing that faith and mental health, they're not enemies. They can exist together, totally. Sometimes that even means encouraging someone to talk to a professional and keep up their spiritual practices.
Denicky covers so much ground in this book. It's been really fascinating to unpack these disorders, especially in the context of faith.
It really is.
But it feels like we need to talk about the more everyday mental health stuff too, like anxiety, depression, the things that honestly most people deal with at some point. Does Denicky get into that at all?
He does. Because let's be real, who hasn't felt anxious or down? It's normal. But Denicky talks about how those common struggles, they might look different in a church setting, which is interesting.
Okay, I'm curious. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, think about anxiety. It's one thing to be anxious about, I don't know, a big presentation at work. But Denicky talks about how in a church, anxiety can morph into this thing called religious scrupulosity.
Religious. What was that word? Scrupulosity. That sounds kind of scary.
It's actually a form of OCD. But instead of being about germs or something, it's all about religion, these obsessive religious fears, these compulsions. Like someone might be terrified they've sinned or constantly worry if they're good enough for God.
And in a church setting, I can see that being easily misinterpreted, right? Like people might think they're just extra devout or something.
Totally. And that's where it gets dangerous. What looks like piety on the outside could be masking a serious internal struggle.
And then there's the whole thing about spiritual warfare,
Mhm.
which Denicky brings up as potentially playing a role in mental health. That feels like a really sensitive topic.
Oh, yeah. And Denecky's careful about how he handles it. He's very clear that mental illness with a biological cause is a real thing, separate from what he calls spiritual oppression. But he also says that sometimes those lines can blur.
Which makes me wonder, how are you supposed to know the difference? If someone is really struggling, how can you tell if it's like clinical depression or if maybe there's a spiritual component?
That is the million-dollar question. And Denecky doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He just says, we've got to be discerning. We need wisdom from mental health experts and spiritual leaders.
So it's not either. It's about bringing both perspectives to the table.
Exactly. We have to approach these situations with humility, and with an open mind.
One of the things that strikes me about Denicky's approach is how holistic it is. He's not saying it's all medical or all spiritual, but that you need both.
Totally. It's like he's saying our minds, our bodies, our spirits, they're all connected. We can't just address one and ignore the others.
And at the end of the day, we've got to create churches where these conversations can actually happen openly, honestly, no judgment. Because if we're not making space for that, are we really living out Christ's love?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think is what Denicky wants us to wrestle with. What would it look like if churches were known for being places of hope and healing for people with mental health challenges, where people felt safe asking for help and knew they wouldn't be judged?
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening, I'm not going to lie. This book is way more than just a mental health textbook.
It is.
It's like Denicky wants us to confront our own biases, to ask the hard questions about faith and mental health, and then to actually do something to support people in our churches who might be struggling.
Absolutely. For me, the biggest takeaway is just we can't be silent about this anymore. The church has to be a place where we talk openly about mental health, where people feel safe getting help, and where grace and understanding are the rule, not the exception.
I love that. So well said. And on that note, I want to thank all of you for joining us on this deep dive into mental health in the church by Peter Denicky. It's been heavy at times, but so important. And remember, you are not alone. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help. There are resources out there, and there is always hope.